The notification on my phone didn't show a text from my fiancé. It showed a bank alert. Balance minus $100,000. My heart didn't just drop. It stopped. I was in a room that cost more than my life, wearing a midnight blue silk robe that wasn't mine, and staring at a man who looked like he'd just bought the sun and was deciding whether to put it out. Killian Vane leaned in, his breath cold against my ear, and whispered, "You have exactly 60 seconds to tell me how you plan to pay me back, Ava. Or I can tell you how I plan to collect." Most people wake up with a hangover. I woke up with a debt that tied me to a billionaire who refused to let me go. They say money can buy anything, but I was about to learn it could buy a person's entire future. To understand why a billionaire would frame a stranger for $100,000 just to keep her from leaving his sight, you have to go back just one night. To the moment I stepped into the gala and realized the man at the head of the table had been watching me for years. The Vane Charity Gala was the kind of event where the champagne cost more than my annual rent and the air was thick with the scent of old money and predatory ambition. I was there as an architect, a rising star hoping to secure a legacy project that would finally pull my firm out of the red. My fiancé, Marcus, had straightened my collar and kissed my cheek, his eyes darting toward the VIP section with a hunger I should have recognized as a warning. He promised to meet me after his business chat, leaving me to navigate the sea of silk and shadows alone. That was when I felt it. The weight of a gaze so heavy, it felt like a physical touch. At the center of the room, seated at a table draped in obsidian velvet, was Killian Vane. He didn't participate in the frantic networking or the polite laughter of the elite. He simply sat, a monochromatic force of nature in a pitch-black suit, fidgeting with a single black ace of spades. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the roar of the gala faded into a deafening silence. There was no warmth in his expression, only a terrifying, clinical patience. I took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, my hand trembling slightly under the intensity of Killian's stare. I thought it was nerves. I thought it was the thrill of being noticed by the most powerful man in the city. But as the first sip hit my tongue, the room began to tilt. The crystal chandeliers blurred into streaks of light, and the floor felt like it was dissolving beneath my feet. Marcus was nowhere to be found. The last thing I remembered was the cold, steady hand of a stranger catching me before I hit the marble, and the distant rhythmic clicking of a heavy watch. Now, sitting in the suffocating luxury of Killian's penthouse, the reality of that night has crystallized into a nightmare. The old money elegance I had carefully cultivated was gone, replaced by a midnight blue robe and a gold anklet that felt like a brand. Killian hasn't moved. He stands by the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights reflecting off his sharp jawline. I look at the minus $100,000 on my screen, and then at him, realizing that the gala wasn't an opportunity. It was an auction. And I was the only item on the block.
The transition from the intoxicating buzz of the charity gala to the clinical silence of the penthouse was a blur of velvet shadows and shattered expectations. Most people wake up with a hangover, a pounding headache, and a hazy memory of too much expensive wine. I woke up with a debt that tied me to a billionaire who refused to let me go. They say money can buy anything, from the finest silks to the most elusive reputations. But I was about to learn it could buy a person's entire future with a single signature. To understand why I ended up trapped in a gilded cage with a man whose eyes held more secrets than the night itself, You have to go back just one night. You have to see the vibrant, hopeful version of me that stepped into that ballroom, oblivious to the fact that the air I breathed was already owned by someone else. It started at the Charity Gala, an event where my art and, as it turned out, my life were both for sale to the highest bidder. I had arrived at the gala with my head held high, my latest collection of sketches draped in the centre of the room like offerings to the elite. I was Ava, the rising star of old money architecture, wearing a gown that spoke of a heritage and a confidence that suggested I belonged. I thought the gazes following me were a sign of professional admiration, but I failed to realise that in a room full of predators, I was merely being appraised. Killian Vane sat at the head of the most prestigious table, a monochromatic figure who seemed to absorb the light around him. He didn't participate in the frantic networking. He simply watched me with a terrifying, clinical patience that made the champagne in my hand feel like liquid ice. Every time I laughed at a potential donor's joke or explained the vision behind a blueprint, I could feel his eyes tracking the movement of my lips, the curve of my neck, and the gold anklet that caught the light whenever I moved. I didn't know then that the gala was a front, a sophisticated stage where my fiancé, Marcus, was already trading my agency for his own survival. While I was selling my vision for the future, Marcus was selling me. By the time the final toast was raised, the trap had already snapped shut. Now, as I sit in this opulent prison, staring at the bank alert that confirms my life is no longer mine, the phantom debt feels like a physical weight against my chest. Killian Vane isn't just a creditor. He is the man who realised that the best way to keep a bird from flying away isn't to break its wings, but to buy the sky. The world thinks I'm a success. They see the sketches, the awards, and the rising career that I spent a decade building from the ground up. To the outside observer, I am a woman who has mastered her own destiny, a professional who commands respect in every boardroom she enters, but they don't see the invisible leash that now tightens with every breath I take. I woke up in a gilded cage, surrounded by the kind of luxury that feels like a threat, staring at a debt I didn't create. It is a debt held by a man who doesn't believe in accidents, a man who understands that the most effective way to own someone is to make them responsible for a crime they never committed. To understand why a billionaire would go through the elaborate effort of framing a stranger for $100,000 just to keep her from leaving his sight. You have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the moment I stepped into the Vane Gala, my heels clicking against the marble floor of a ballroom that felt more like a hunting ground than a celebration. I walked in with the polished confidence of someone who belonged there, unaware that I was already a marked asset. It was in that room, under the suffocating scent of expensive lilies and the cold shimmer of 1,000 diamonds, that I realised the man at the head of the table hadn't just noticed me that night. Killian Vane had been watching me for years, waiting for the perfect moment to turn my success into my prison. He sat motionless, a figure of monochromatic power who seemed to absorb the frantic energy of the socialites around him, while my fiancé, Marcus, buzzed around the VIP section with a desperation that should have been my first warning. Killian simply existed at the centre of the storm. He wasn't networking, he was observing. Every award I had won, every high-profile sketch I had published, had been a breadcrumb leading him directly to me. I thought I was climbing a ladder, but I was actually walking into a carefully constructed trap. By the time I felt the first wave of dizziness from a drink I didn't remember ordering, the Vane Gala had already served its purpose. I wasn't there to celebrate my career. I was there to be liquidated.
The Vane Charity Gala was designed to be the crowning moment of my career, a night where the architecture of my dreams would finally meet the capital of the elite. I moved through the ballroom with the effortless grace of someone born into old money elegance, my midnight blue silk gown whispering against the marble floors. To the titans of industry circling me, I was the picture of success, composed, brilliant, and entirely in control. I didn't feel like prey, I felt like the architect of my own destiny. But from the head of the obsidian-draped table, Killian Vane was busy deconstructing that illusion. He sat in monochromatic silence, his sharp, lethal gaze cutting through the crowd like a surgical blade. While I laughed and shook hands, he checked his heavy, expensive watch with a terrifying, calculated patience. He wasn't there to support the arts. He was there to claim an asset he had been appraising for years. Every time I looked toward the VIP section, I found his flint-colored eyes already waiting for me, tracking the pulse at my throat with the focus of a man who doesn't believe in accidents. Marcus, my fiancé, was a frantic contrast to Killian's stillness. He adjusted his tight suit and twisted his fake designer ring with a nervous energy that I mistook for excitement. "This is it, Ava," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the shadows where Killian's men stood. "One more drink to celebrate the legacy." He handed me a crystal flute, the champagne bubbling with a deceptive, golden light. I trusted him. I trusted the room. I accepted the glass, taking a sip, as I looked out at the sea of influential figures who supposedly respected me. The old money control I had spent a lifetime perfecting didn't leave me all at once. It eroded. First, the scent of expensive lilies became suffocatingly thick. Then the chandeliers above began to spin into a dizzying, crystalline web. The voices of the donors faded into a rhythmic, underwater thrum. I reached for the table to steady myself, but my fingers felt like lead. Through the encroaching darkness, I saw Killian Vane rise from his seat. He didn't look surprised or rushed. He simply began to walk toward me, the black ace of spades tucked between his fingers as my world finally and violently went black.
Consciousness returned not as a gradual awakening, but as a cold, sharp intrusion of reality. My eyelids felt weighted, and when they finally fluttered open, the soft amber glow of a high-end penthouse assaulted my vision. This wasn't the warm familiarity of my own apartment. The air was sterile, smelling of leather and a cedar-scented cologne that made my stomach turn. I tried to sit up, but the world tilted violently. My hair, usually pinned into a sleek, professional knot, was a disheveled mess across my shoulders, and the sticky residue of smudged mascara burned the corners of my eyes. I was draped in a midnight blue silk robe that felt like liquid ice against my skin, a garment I didn't recognize, replaced while I was unconscious. My hand fumbled for the edge of the plush mattress, searching for some semblance of control, until my fingers brushed against my phone. The screen flickered to life, the brightness cutting through the dim room. A single notification sat at the center of the display, a digital death sentence that made the air vanish from my lungs. A bank alert. Balance minus $100,000. The silence of the room was broken by a rhythmic, mechanical clicking. I turned my head slowly, every muscle protesting, to find Killian Vane seated in a low-slung velvet armchair near the window. He was a shadow of monochromatic power against the backdrop of the city's glowing skyline. He didn't look at me immediately. Instead, his focus was fixed on the heavy, expensive watch on his wrist. He was checking the time with a terrifying, clinical patience, as if he had calculated exactly how many minutes it would take for my brain to process the depth of my ruin. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He finally looked up, his flint-colored eyes devoid of empathy. He didn't need to explain the debt. The digital red numbers on my phone said enough. I looked down at my hands, trembling violently against the silk of the robe, and realized that the old money dignity I had worn like armor at the gala had been stripped away. I wasn't an architect or a success anymore. I was a line item in his ledger. Killian rose from his seat, the movement fluid and predatory, and I realized he hadn't just been waiting for me to wake up. He had been waiting for the exact moment I realized that I was owned.
The silence in the penthouse was thick enough to suffocate, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic ticking of Killian's watch. I clutched the midnight blue silk of my robe, my eyes darting from the terrifying red numbers on my phone to the man who looked like he had just purchased my soul. Killian didn't offer a glass of water or a word of comfort. Instead, he stood and walked toward the obsidian desk, his movements fluid and predatory. He retrieved a tablet, flicking a finger across the screen before turning it toward me. The footage was grainy but undeniable. It showed me, or a woman who wore my face and my gown, standing at a high-stakes table in an underground casino I had never visited. I watched in horror as I pressed a thumb to a biometric scanner, authorizing a bet that would ruin a small country. "A losing hand, Ava," Killian said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a chill down my spine. $100,000. My rivals were prepared to collect in blood. I simply stepped in and bought the debt. "I was drugged," I whispered, my voice cracking as the realization of the phantom debt set in. "I never signed those papers. I never went to that place." Killian didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single black ace of spades, fidgeting with it as he closed the distance between us. "The world doesn't care about the truth. It cares about the record. And the record says you are a gambler who failed." He knelt before me, the movement so sudden it made my breath hitch. From a small velvet box on the floor, he produced a thin, delicate gold anklet. It shimmered with a deceptive beauty, but as he reached for my leg, I saw the tiny, intricate lock dangling from the chain. His fingers were like ice against my skin as he fastened the gold around my ankle. I tried to pull away, but his grip was absolute, unyielding and clinical. With a soft, final click, the lock snapped shut. "You are an architect, Ava. You understand the importance of a foundation." He looked up, his flint-colored eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "This is yours. You aren't leaving this penthouse until every cent is accounted for. And since I own a collection agency, I decide when the balance is zero." I looked down at the shimmering chain, a beautiful brand that marked me as his guild prisoner. I was a woman of old money heritage, a professional at the height of my career, yet I was now a captive in a high-stakes game where Killian Vane held all the cards. He rose to his full height, checking his watch one last time. He didn't believe in accidents, and as I stared at the lock I had no key for, I realized he had been planning this coronation for years.
The golden anklet felt like a lead weight against my skin, a constant shimmering reminder that my freedom had been appraised and sold. Killian remained by the window, his silhouette a sharp monochromatic blade against the city lights. He didn't look at me as he tapped a command into his phone, his voice dropping to that terrifyingly calm register. I believe you're familiar with the man currently pacing in my foyer. The double doors swung open, and Marcus stumbled in, looking every bit the new money desperate socialite I had once mistaken for a partner. His suit was a fraction too tight, his hair a frantic mess, and his hands were in constant motion, nervously twisting the fake designer ring on his finger. The one he claimed was an heirloom, but I now saw was as hollow as his promises. When his eyes met mine, he didn't rush to my side. Instead, he flinched. "Ava, honey, I can explain," he stammered, his gaze darting toward Killian with the submissive terror of a beaten dog. "Explain the gala, Marcus," Killian commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that left no room for evasion. Killian didn't even turn around. He just stood there, checking his expensive watch with clinical detachment. The truth spilled out of Marcus like a confession from a man who knew he was already drowning. He hadn't just stood me up at the gala. He had been the one to hand me that final drugged glass of champagne. He had watched me slip into the darkness, not out of malice, but out of a narcissistic coward's greed. He had run up massive debts with Killian's rivals, trying to fund a lifestyle our old money heritage couldn't sustain. When the collectors came for his life, he offered them mine instead. He had used my biometric data to authorize the phantom debt, selling my reputation to the highest bidder with the delusional hope that he could play the hero later. He thought he could rescue me once the dust settled, somehow keeping both the money and his fiancé. He looked at me then, his face twisted into a pathetic plea for forgiveness, still twisting that hollow ring. "I did it for us, Ava. I just needed a win," he cried out, the desperation in his voice echoing off the marble walls. I looked at him, the man I was supposed to marry, and felt a coldness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The betrayal was surgical. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had dismantled my life to cover his tracks. Killian finally turned, the black ace of spades appearing between his fingers like a magician's trick. He looked at Marcus as if he were a minor glitch in a perfect system, then looked at me. "The rat has served his purpose," Killian said, his flint-colored eyes narrowing. "Now, Ava, you see why the debt belongs to me, because unlike Marcus, I don't hide behind a fake ring. I simply take what I want."
The pathetic echoes of Marcus's pleas still hung in the air, but I couldn't breathe in the same room as the man who had sold my life for a hollow victory. I bolted toward the heavy mahogany doors, my heels clicking frantically against the marble, but before my hand could even touch the cold brass handle, Killian's voice sliced through the silence like a razor. "You can walk through those doors, Ava," he said, his tone as clinical as a death sentence. I froze, my back to him, as the soft, rhythmic sound of a card snapping against his palm filled the space. I turned slowly to find him leaning against his obsidian desk, fidgeting with a single black ace of spades. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had already accounted for every possible variable. "You're a prisoner!" I hissed, my hand tightening into a fist as the gold anklet weighed heavy on my skin. "You drugged me, you framed me, and you think I'm just going to stay here and play your consultant?" Killian pushed off the desk, his presence moving toward me like a cold front. He didn't stop until he was inches away, the scent of cedar and iron-wrought power suffocating my defiance. He held up his phone, and with a flick of his thumb, the screen displayed a high-definition still of the gambling footage. My face, clear and unmistakable, as I authorized that ruinous bet. "The press is a hungry animal, Ava," he murmured, his breath ghosting over my ear. "And right now, they see you as the pristine architect of old money grace, but if this footage hits the wires, they'll see a desperate addict who gambled away her firm's future in a dirty basement." He paused, letting the weight of the threat sink in. "Your career wouldn't just be over, it would be liquidated. No firm would hire you, No client would trust you, and your heritage would become a punchline. I looked into his flint-coloured eyes and realised he wasn't bluffing. He didn't. He had planned, wasn't just for Marcus. He had planned wasn't just for Marcus. It was for any version of me that thought it could survive without his protection. I am a man of terms, Killian continued, his thumb tracing the sharp edge of the ace. You stay. You work under my name. You play the part of the devoted partner until I decide the ledger is balanced. In return, the footage stays in my vault, and the Liquidator keeps the wolves at bay. He checked his expensive watch, the mechanical click sounding like a gavel. You have 30 seconds to decide if your pride is worth more than your legacy. I looked at the door, then back at the man who had turned my life into a high-stakes transaction. The cage was gilded and the leash was invisible, but the reality was absolute. I wasn't just owing him money, I was owing him my existence. I let out a jagged breath, my hand falling away from the door handle. I was trapped in the Vane Gala forever, and Killian Vane was the only one with the key.
The silence of the penthouse was broken not by a command, but by the frantic, uneven thumping of someone who didn't belong in this world of polished obsidian and steel. The elevator doors slid open to reveal Marcus, looking haggard and desperate. His hair was no longer perfectly styled, and he gripped his fake designer ring with a white-knuckled intensity as he stepped onto the marble. He looked at me, huddled in my midnight blue silk, and then at Killian, who hadn't moved from his position by the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Ava, I'm getting you out of here," Marcus blurted out, his voice cracking with a false bravado that set my teeth on edge. He took a staggering step toward me, reaching out as if he could simply pull me back into the ruins of our old life. "I've made a deal. I can fix this. You don't have to stay with this monster." Killian didn't move to intercept him. He didn't reach for a weapon or even turn around. Instead, he simply checked his heavy, expensive watch, the mechanical click sounding like the cocking of a hammer in the quiet room. The temperature didn't just drop, it vanished. Killian's presence acted like a cold front, a silent, atmospheric pressure that made the air too thin for a man like Marcus to breathe. "A deal, Marcus?" Killian's voice was a low, gravelly vibration that barely rose above a whisper, yet it filled every corner of the suite. He finally turned, his flint-colored eyes settling on Marcus with a look of profound clinical boredom. "You mean the agreement you tried to strike with the Petrova Syndicate this morning? The one where you offered to sell Ava's proprietary architectural blueprints in exchange for your own debt forgiveness?" Marcus froze, his hand falling to his side as the blood drained from his face. The new money arrogance he had tried to weaponize was crushed under the weight of Killian's surveillance. I was trying to find a way," Marcus stammered, his eyes darting frantically for an exit that didn't exist. "You were trying to liquidate your last remaining asset," Killian interrupted, his tone devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. He walked toward Marcus with a slow, predatory grace, stopping just inches away. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't need to. He simply held up a single black ace of spades. "You see, Marcus, the difference between a shark and a rat is that the shark at least has the dignity to kill its own prey. You just want to live off the scraps of a woman you aren't worthy to look at." Without raising his voice, Killian dismantled Marcus's entire existence. He detailed every failed investment, every forged signature, and every cowardly lie Marcus had ever told. By the time Killian was finished, Marcus wasn't just a traitor. He was nothing. He was a hollow shell of a man, shrinking back into the elevator as if the very light in the room was burning him. As the elevator doors hissed shut, leaving us in a heavy, charged silence, Killian looked down at the gold anklet on my leg. "The sharks are already circling, Ava," he murmured, his gaze returning to the city skyline. "Marcus wasn't here to save you. He was here to sell the rest of you. I'm the only reason they haven't started tearing you apart yet." I looked at the shimmering lock on my ankle and realized the terrifying truth. The man holding my leash was the only thing standing between me and the abyss. The days in the penthouse bled together, a seamless loop of luxury and surveillance that began to reveal the intricate architecture of Killian's monochromatic world. I was no longer a guest, nor was I a simple prisoner. I was being integrated into a machine that functioned with a terrifying, silent efficiency. Everything in Killian's life was categorized as either an asset or a liability. And as I watched him navigate through encrypted calls and high-stakes ledgers, I realized where I stood. I wasn't just a debtor to him. I was the prize he had been stalking for a lifetime. The realization didn't come in a sudden explosion, but in a series of quiet, unsettling discoveries. While working at the obsidian desk he had assigned me, I found a digital folder buried deep within the secure server. It wasn't filled with bank transcripts or architectural blueprints. It was filled with me. There were photos of my graduation, the first sketch I ever sold, and even the candid moment I had walked away from his family's business proposal 3 years ago. I remembered that day, the way I had told his father that my vision wasn't for sale. I had thought it was a closed chapter, a moment of professional integrity. But to Killian, it was the day the hunt began. He walked into the room, his presence as cold and sudden as a shadow crossing the sun. He didn't look at the screen, yet I knew he was aware of exactly what I had found. He sat in the chair opposite me, fidgeting with the black ace of spades, his flint-colored eyes unreadable. "You were always the most difficult acquisition, Ava," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "Most people have a price. You had a soul. I had to wait for someone else to break it before I could step in to fix the pieces." The rules of the game shifted in that moment. I realized that the phantom debt wasn't about the $100,000. That was just the paperwork used to justify the cage. This was an obsession that had been nurtured in the dark, a patient strategy to wait for my weakest moment so it could become my only necessity. But as I looked at the gold anklet shimmering against my skin, a new thought took root. If I was his most prized asset, then I held a power that Marcus never could have understood. I leaned back, mirroring his stillness, and for the first time, I didn't look away from his lethal gaze. "If I'm an asset, Killian, then you know that assets have to be maintained," I said, my voice steadying with a newfound, calculated edge. "And right now, this asset is tired of being a spectator." A ghost of a smirk touched his sharp jawline, gone before it could truly form. He checked his watch, the mechanical click signaling a change in the atmosphere. The rules were changing every hour, and the predator was starting to realize that his prey was no longer just trying to escape. I was starting to learn how to play within the lines of his monochromatic empire, and if I was going to be a gilded prisoner, I was going to ensure I was the most expensive one he had ever tried to keep.
The calm within the penthouse was shattered by the frantic glow of a dozen news alerts. Marcus, cornered and hollowed out by Killian's dismantling of his life, had played his final scorched earth card. The phantom debt was no longer a secret. Grainy photos of the underground casino were flooding the tabloids, accompanied by headlines that questioned the integrity of the city's favorite old money architect. The wolves weren't just at the door, they were howling for blood, tipped off by a man who would rather see me ruined than owned by another. I stood by the window, watching the flickering lights of news vans gathering far below like vultures circling a kill. The gold anklet felt heavier than ever, a physical weight that seemed to pull me toward the floor. My legacy, my name, and every blueprint I had ever drawn were being shredded in the digital court of public opinion. I felt the air in the room thicken as Killian stepped out of the shadows, his monochromatic suit as sharp as the ultimatum he was about to deliver. The press is a beast that doesn't care about the truth, only the scent of a fall, Killian said, his voice a low, steady vibration that cut through my panic. He didn't look at the television, he looked at me, his flint-colored eyes assessing my breaking point. He placed a single, heavy document on the obsidian desk. Beside it lay a fountain pen that caught the cold light of the city. Marcus has ensured that your old life is dead, Ava. By tomorrow morning, you will either be a disgraced gambler or something else entirely. I turned to face him, my midnight blue silk robe rustling. Something else? Killian took a step closer, his presence a cold front that demanded absolute attention. I don't believe in half measures. I have already drafted the counter-narrative. I can prove the footage was a deep fake. And I can crush Marcus into the dirt so deep he'll never see the sun again. But my protection isn't a charity. He gestured towards the document. This is a new contract. It merges our firms and ties our names together, permanently. You won't just be my consultant, you will be my partner, in business and in name. You sign this, and the Vane Empire becomes your shield. You don't, and you walk out that door into the teeth of the storm alone. The choice was a surgical strike. He was offering me the world, but the price was the very last shred of the independence I had fought so hard to maintain. I looked at the pen, then back at the man who had been watching me for years, waiting for this exact moment of total vulnerability. The rules had changed again. This wasn't about $100,000 anymore. It was about a total merger of souls. You want to own the architect, I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of fury and a terrifying dark realization. I want the architect to build my world, Killian corrected, his thumb tracing the edge of his watch. And I want the world to know she belongs nowhere else. I looked at the shimmering lock on my ankle and then at the paper. The press was waiting to tear me apart. And the only man who could save me was the one who had built the trap in the first place. I reached for the pen, the weight of it feeling like a scepter as I prepared to sign away the woman I used to be.
The ink on the contract was barely dry when the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from a prison to a war room. I looked down at the signature that effectively merged my soul with the Vane Empire. And for the first time, I didn't feel the crushing weight of the gold anklet. Instead, I felt its heat. I realized that while I hadn't chosen the game, and I certainly hadn't chosen the dealer, I was now the most powerful card in the deck. If Killian Vane wanted me to be his partner, I would show him exactly what an architect could do when she stopped building cathedrals and started building fortresses. I didn't wait for his command. I walked to the obsidian desk and pulled the monitors toward me, my fingers flying across the keys with a clinical precision that mirrored Killian's own. He stood behind me, his presence a steady, monochromatic shadow, watching as I began to navigate the vast, lethal resources of his network. I wasn't looking for a way out anymore. I was looking for the throat of everyone who had thought I was a pawn to be traded. "You said you liquidate liabilities, Killian," I murmured, my voice losing its tremor and gaining a cold, resonant edge. "Let's start with Marcus." With a flick of a finger, I authorized the release of the real evidence Killian had been holding in reserve. The records of Marcus's embezzlement, his forged signatures, and the deliberate drugging of a woman he claimed to love. I watched in silence as his bank accounts froze and his new money world imploded in real time. By the time the sun began to rise over the skyline, Marcus wasn't just ruined. He was erased. I felt no pity, only a sharp, architectural satisfaction in seeing a faulty structure demolished. But I didn't stop there. I used the Vane reach to systematically dismantle the rivals who had tried to use my biometric data, turning their own predatory tactics against them until they were begging for the mercy Killian never gave. I was no longer a debtor or a gilded prisoner. I was the sovereign architect of a new reality. I stopped fighting the lock on my ankle because I realized it wasn't just a sign that I was his. It was a sign to the rest of the world that they couldn't touch me without facing him. Killian walked to my side, his flint-colored eyes reflecting a grim sort of pride. He didn't say he loved me. Men like him didn't use such fragile words. He simply adjusted his heavy watch and placed a hand on the back of my chair, a gesture of absolute possession that I no longer pulled away from. "The debt is settled, Ava," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that felt like a foundation. "The debt is settled," I agreed, rising to stand beside him as we looked out over the city that now belonged to both of us. But the collection has just begun. I stood there, elegant and lethal. The woman who had woken up owing $100,000 and ended up owning the man who refused to let her walk away. The game was over, and the queen had taken her throne. I have VA. They say money can buy anything. I used to believe that. I used to believe in freedom, in choice, in building my own destiny. But then I woke up owing $100,000, trapped in a gilded cage by a man who didn't just want my money. He wanted me, and he refused to let me walk away. AVA. Marcus thought he could sell me. Killian's rivals thought they could break me. They saw an old money architect, a woman easy to manipulate. They didn't see the fire. They didn't see the will to survive. But Killian Vane saw it. He saw the asset he truly desired, and he built a trap so intricate, so inescapable, that I had no choice but to step into his world. Ava, the gold anklet was meant to be a chain, a reminder of my debt, of my captivity. But somewhere along the way, it became a crown, a symbol of the empire I now help command. I stopped fighting the cage because I realized the cage was merely a fortress, and I, the gilded prisoner, had become its sovereign queen. Ava. I didn't choose the game, but I absolutely chose how to win it. They say a man like Killian Vane owns everything he touches. What they don't realize is that sometimes the prize owns him too. My name is Ava, and this is just the beginning.